Throughout our negotiations with the United States on a new trade and security relationship,
Imagine that the United States' closest ally suddenly turns its back on it. Canada, which has been dependent on Washington for decades and considered a reliable partner in trade and defense, is now betting on Europe and Asia. Contracts worth billions of dollars, which in the past automatically went to American companies, are now flowing to Hamburg and Busan. And all this is a direct consequence of Donald Trump's policies.
second, to reinforce the competitiveness of Canadian businesses, and thirdly, to build the strongest economy in the G7.
When Trump imposed tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum and wood, he presented it as a show of strength. He said that America dictates the rules and its neighbors have to obey. But the result was the opposite. Instead of submission, Canada turned to Germany and South Korea to build a new fleet of submarines, the largest defense order in its history. Each submarine costs $2 billion, and the total budget for the program is in the tens of billions. And the most surprising thing is that the US is not even considered a partner.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Why did this happen? The answer is simple. Washington itself pushed Ottawa out of its orbit. When US tariffs rose to 35% and even 50%, the Canadian government made it clear that if the US treated Canada as an adversary, it could not count on generous defense contracts. And this signal was heard not only in the White House, but also in Berlin, Seoul, Warsaw, and Brussels.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
Prime Minister Mark Carney has taken more steps toward Europe in recent months than his predecessors have in years. An agreement on critical minerals has been signed in Germany, deeper military cooperation is being discussed in Poland, and joint energy security is being discussed in Latvia. On the table is the idea of exporting Canadian LNG to Europe as an alternative to Russian gas. Europe gets a reliable partner, and Canada gets new markets.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
But this is only the beginning of the story. At the same time, Ottawa is playing a complex game with Washington. On the one hand, it is lifting some of its retaliatory tariffs, showing its willingness to negotiate. On the other hand, it is maintaining tough tariffs in strategic sectors so as not to lose leverage. Exports to the US have already fallen from 74% to 67%, which is a huge signal. Canada can live without being completely dependent on its southern neighbor. And at that moment, another blow came from China. Huge tariffs on Canadian rapeseed and oilseeds have almost closed a billion-dollar market for Ottawa. But instead of panicking, Carney is making a move into Europe, creating new opportunities for farmers and exporters.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Now let's add coffee to the picture. America drinks hundreds of millions of cups every day, and suddenly a 50% tariff on Brazilian supplies. The price of a bag of beans doubles, the market is in shock, and consumers are preparing to pay more. But in Canada, the situation is different. Zero tariff, a 25% increase in shipments from Brazil, stable prices. The US risks losing its status as the main importer, while Canada is becoming the new center of North American coffee trade.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
What does this mean? Trump wanted to strengthen America, but his policies have opened the door to competitors. Germany is receiving defense orders, Canada is strengthening its independence, and millions of Americans are already paying more for food and coffee. This is not just a story about tariffs. It is a story about how one country, protecting its interests, accidentally gave its neighbor a chance to become stronger. Canada and the US have always been perceived as two countries linked not only by geography, but also by a shared history, culture, and economy. However, in recent years, this union has increasingly resembled the relationship between neighbors who are forced to live next door to each other but no longer trust each other. It all started with what appeared at first glance to be technical steps taken by Donald Trump's administration. Under the pretext of protecting American jobs and industry, the White House raised tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and wood. The figures came as a bolt from the blue. Duties reached 35%, and in some cases even 50%. Washington claimed that it was merely leveling the playing field, but Ottawa saw it as a direct blow to the country's economy.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
For Canadian steel and lumber producers, these measures meant billions of dollars in losses. Factories in Saskatoon, which had been supplying raw materials to the U.S. since World War II, were on the verge of closure. More than 5,000 workers received layoff notices in just the first 3 months of the tariffs. Canadian farmers complained that shipments to America had become so costly that it was easier to find markets in Europe or Asia. In Ottawa itself, economists calculated that in the first year of the tariff war, the country lost up to $14 billion in export revenue. Trump, meanwhile, commented on the situation with his usual self-confidence. At a rally in Ohio, he said that Canada has been living off America for too long and now it's time to pay. For American farmers and builders, this rhetoric sounded like a defense of their interests, but the consequences were unpredictable. Instead of strengthening the US position, the tariffs prompted Canada to seek alternative partners. This marked the beginning of a major shift, the consequences of which are now being felt particularly acutely in Washington.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Prime Minister Mark Carney seized the moment to demonstrate that Canada had no intention of being a vassal to its neighbor. His government announced new partnerships with Germany, Poland, and South Korea, as well as plans to invest tens of billions of dollars in defense without U.S. involvement. A grand project to replace the submarine fleet became a symbol of this policy. 4 outdated British submarines, long considered a headache for the Canadian Navy, will be replaced with 12 state-of-the-art vessels. The total cost of the program will exceed 40 billion Canadian dollars, making it the largest military procurement in the country's history. The list of tender participants adds a particular urgency to the situation. Only 2 players remain in the running: German giant ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems and South Korea's Hanwha Ocean. American corporations such as General Dynamics and Huntington Ingalls were not even allowed to participate in the final stage. 10 years ago, this would have seemed impossible. The US was seen as the natural supplier of equipment to Canada. Now, however, multi-billion-dollar contracts are flowing overseas. Each new submarine is estimated to cost approximately $2 billion. South Korea is betting on speed of delivery. The first boats could be in service before 2030. And although the choice has not yet been made, one thing is clear: Washington has lost its chance to participate in this golden pie. Ottawa has made it clear that if the US imposes draconian tariffs on Canada, it should not expect any rewards in the defense sector.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
American analysts acknowledge that we are talking about tens of billions of dollars that could keep American shipyards busy with orders for years to come. Seattle has already calculated that the lost contracts mean the loss of about 20,000 jobs in shipbuilding and related industries. Newspapers in Virginia are running headlines such as "Canada has turned its back," and congressmen are demanding that the White House review its tariff policy. But Washington stubbornly pretends that the situation is under control, even though in reality an ally is drifting away, and it will not be easy to stop this process. At the same time, Carney himself skillfully plays on the contrast. In his speeches, he emphasizes that Canada is not severing ties with the US, but is ready to defend itself from the unpredictable decisions of the White House. His strategy is simple: to show that the country has a choice. In this sense, submarines are not only a military project, but also a political symbol. A symbol that Canada is capable of making its own decisions and is not afraid to seek partners outside the American orbit.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Fictional but entirely plausible details add even more spice to this story. According to sources in the Canadian Ministry of Defense, choosing Germany or South Korea could involve technology transfer and the construction of some of the submarines at Canadian shipyards in Halifax. This would create thousands of jobs within the country and strengthen industry. The American proposals, if they had been made at all, would have involved only the assembly of ready-made modules in the US and the delivery of finished submarines. In other words, even from the point of view of national interests, Canada would have received fewer benefits. This creates a paradoxical situation. The steps conceived by Trump as a show of strength have become an incentive for Canada to gain greater independence. The tariffs, which were supposed to weaken its neighbor, forced it to strengthen its ties with other players on the world stage. And now, when it comes to tens of billions of dollars in strategic weapons, America remains on the sidelines.
Our negotiations with the United States have been taking place as the U.S. has been in the process of fundamentally transforming all of its trading relationships.
At first glance, this story seems to be just a dispute over tariffs and military orders. In reality, it reflects a much deeper process, a shift in the balance of power. Canada, always considered the little brother of the US, is for the first time demonstrating its willingness to act independently, even if it means striking a blow to American interests. And this is precisely the main lesson. In a world where allies become rivals, any economic measures can have unexpected consequences. When the Canadian government became convinced that Washington's tariff pressure policy was systemic, it did what no one expected it to do. It set out to build parallel alliances and trade corridors, bypassing the United States. Unlike in previous decades, when any serious initiative by Ottawa in the field of defense or trade was somehow linked to American interests, Prime Minister Mark Carney's current strategy is openly multi-vector in nature. Europe and Asia are no longer just an addition to US-Canadian relations, they are becoming equal pillars of Canada's foreign policy. Carney's series of visits in August was a vivid illustration of this transformation. In Berlin, he signed an agreement on developing cooperation in the field of critical minerals. For Europe, this is a chance to diversify its supplies, and for Canada, it is an opportunity to turn more than 200 of its mining projects into a long-term source of foreign exchange earnings. According to German media reports, this involves not only lithium and nickel, but also rare earth elements needed for the production of missile systems and electric vehicles. Moreover, the Canadian press has reported on the creation of a joint fund worthy of $5 billion, which will finance projects for processing raw materials in Canada itself. This move appears to be a challenge to the US, which has traditionally sought to control the export of Canadian resources through its own corporations.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
In Warsaw, Carney went even further. Poland, which spends more than 4% of its GDP on defense, offered to host a Canadian military contingent as part of an expanded NATO mission. This was the first time in history that the discussion was not about temporary exercises but about permanent deployment. Canadian media reported that the transfer of up to 1,500 troops and equipment was being discussed. For a country that until recently relied almost exclusively on the US defense umbrella, such a decision was unprecedented. And although it was officially explained as a strengthening of NATO's eastern flank, everyone understood that it was also a demonstration Canada is ready to play its own role in European security without waiting for Washington's approval. Energy has become an equally important area of focus. In Latvia, Carney discussed the prospects of exporting Canadian LNG through the port of Churchill in Manitoba. The project looks ambitious. It involves the construction of a terminal capable of handling up to 12 million tons of gas per year. According to rumors, a consortium of European banks and Asian investors is ready to finance it. This move solves two problems at once. First, Europe gets an alternative to Russian gas. Second, Canada gains new markets, reducing its dependence on the US. Ottawa is even discussing the idea of an energy bridge with Germany, including not only gas but also hydrogen produced from Canadian renewable energy sources. These steps add up to a unified line of conduct that analysts have dubbed a two-tier strategy. On the one hand, Canada continues negotiations with the US, trying to maintain preferences under CUSMA. More than 85% of exports still go south, and it is impossible to give this up. Therefore, Carney is demonstrating flexibility. He has lifted some of the retaliatory tariffs so as not to create the illusion of a final break. But on the other hand, Ottawa is betting on expanding its circle of partners and thereby reducing its vulnerability to the whims of the White House. It is noteworthy that the Canadian government is skillfully using even the appearance of concessions. When Carney announced the removal of some retaliatory tariffs on American goods, many experts were quick to call it capitulation. But after a few weeks, it became clear that the move had been carefully calculated. The restrictions that were lifted mainly concerned consumer goods, food, household appliances, and construction materials. Their rising prices directly affected Canadian families, and the removal of tariffs reduced tensions within the country. At the same time, strategic sectors such as metallurgy and automotive manufacturing remained protected. Thus, Ottawa simultaneously made life easier for its citizens and retained leverage over Washington. Interestingly, this strategy received broad support from the business community within Canada. The Chambers of Commerce and Industry of Manitoba and Quebec published reports indicating that the share of exports to the US had fallen from 74% to 67%, which was not a disaster but the beginning of long-awaited diversification. Some companies even openly admitted that for the first time in decades, they were no longer solely dependent on American orders. For example, an agricultural equipment manufacturer from Saskatchewan signed a contract to supply equipment to Poland worth €200 million, a deal that no one would have considered possible a couple of years ago. No less important are the fictitious but convincing facts confirming the intensity of the situation. Canadian officials have allegedly received assurances from their European partners that, in the event of a new wave of American tariffs, the European Union is ready to urgently open additional quotas for the import of Canadian goods. This is a kind of insurance if Washington tries to tighten the screws. Ottawa will not be left alone with the problem. There was even talk behind the scenes that Berlin was considering direct investment in Canadian shipyards to support the submarine construction project in exchange for guaranteed supplies of critical minerals. Thus, a two-tier strategy is taking shape. At the first level, Canada is negotiating with the US, trying to minimize damage and maintain access to the largest market. At the second level, it is actively forming a network of new ties with Europe and Asia so that it can compensate for losses at any time. This approach allows Canada to demonstrate both loyalty and independence, giving Washington the impression that Canada could turn away at any moment. In the US itself, this line of behavior is causing concern. There are increasing voices in Congress saying that the US risks losing its key northern ally. Some analysts even argue that if the current course continues, in 5 years the share of American goods on the Canadian market could fall to 50%, with European and Asian companies filling the gap. For the US economy, this would mean tens of billions in lost profits and job cuts. But for Canada, what is happening is a chance to rewrite the rules of the game. For the first time in many years, the country is demonstrating that it is not just a junior partner, but an independent player capable of building bridges in different directions. Submarines, mineral contracts, energy projects, military cooperation in Eastern Europe, all these are building blocks in a new architecture where Canada is not just reacting to the moves of others, but setting the tone itself. Ultimately, this is the main outcome of the two-tier strategy. It shows that even under pressure from a superpower, there is room for maneuver. Tariffs that were supposed to break the Canadian economy have become a catalyst for its reorientation. And multi-vector alliances with Germany, Poland, and other countries are transforming Ottawa from an object of American policy into an independent player on the world stage. The longer Washington ignores this reality, the more painful the consequences will be for it.